The moment Rose Dalton rode into Caldwell, Kansas on a blistering July afternoon in 1882, she had every intention of leaving before sundown. She had come to give back what was never truly hers, and she had not planned on staying a single minute longer than necessary. The town of Caldwell sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a man who had been punched too many times and still refused to sit down. It was dusty and loud, and full of the particular energy that cattle towns always had in the summer. Cowboys fresh off the trail with wages burning holes in their pockets, saloons doing a roaring trade, merchants haggling at their storefronts, and the air thick with the smell of horse and leather and frying meat from the cookhouses near the stockyards. Rose had grown up in towns like this, had watched them from the outside her whole life, always passing through, never belonging. She was 24 years old, dark-haired and sun-browned, with eyes the color of creek water after a hard rain, not quite green and not quite gray, and she sat her horse with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned early that the world was not going to be gentle with her. She had ridden nearly 2 days from Wichita to get here, and the envelope tucked inside her coat felt heavier with every mile. $200. It was more money than Rose had ever held in her life, and it did not belong to her. She had told herself that 100 times on the road north, and she was going to keep telling herself that until she had put it back in the hands of the man who had left it. She pulled her bay mare to a stop in front of the town's general store and asked the storekeeper's boy, a freckled child of about 12 who was sweeping the porch, where she might find the Hawkins spread. "You mean the Double H?" the boy said, squinting up at her. "That's about 4 miles east on the Kingfisher Road, ma'am. Big place. You can see the windmill from the road." Rose thanked him and rode on. She did not go to a hotel. She did not stop for water or a meal, though her stomach had been empty since early that morning. She had a purpose, and she intended to see it through before she allowed herself to do anything else. The road east of Caldwell opened up into the broad Kansas grasslands, and the sky above was enormous, the kind of wide, indifferent blue that made a person feel both free and terribly small at the same time. Rose had always had a complicated relationship with the open land. She loved it and feared it in equal measure. It did not make promises, and it did not break them either, which was more than she could say for most people she had known. She found the Double H exactly where the boy had said it would be. The windmill was visible from a quarter-mile out, its blades turning slow in the warm July wind, and beyond it sat a ranch house that was larger than she had expected, not grand exactly, but solid. Built from good timber and limestone, with a wide covered porch and whitewashed window frames and a kitchen garden off the south side that was green and well-tended. There were working pens to the east, cattle milling inside them, and a long barn painted red that was clearly a point of pride for whoever maintained it. The whole place spoke of hard work and serious intention, and for a moment Rose just sat on her horse at the gate and looked at it. She had not known what to expect. She had known almost nothing about Noah Hawkins except that he had been in Wichita for 3 days in June, and that he had done something so extraordinary and so unexpected that it had unsettled her completely. She rode up to the house and dismounted at the hitching post near the porch. She tied the mare and smoothed her coat and walked to the front door and knocked. Nobody answered for a long moment. She could hear activity somewhere behind the house, the sound of hammering and a man's voice calling out to someone. She stepped off the porch and walked around the side of the building, following the noise, and came around the corner of the barn to find 2 men working on the fence line of one of the near paddocks. One was older, gray-haired and stout, and he was holding a fence post steady while the other drove it into the ground with a heavy iron post driver. The other man was Noah Hawkins. She recognized him immediately. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe it was just that out here on his own land, in his own space, he seemed to take up more of the world than he had in Wichita. He was 30 years old, lean and broad-shouldered, with dark blonde hair that the sun had bleached lighter at the tips, and a jaw that was always going to need a shave. He wore a plain canvas shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and worn denim trousers tucked into working boots, and he was swinging that post driver with the focused efficiency of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and was not interested in doing anything else. He did not see her for a moment. The older man saw her first and said something, and Noah turned around, and when he saw Rose standing at the corner of his barn with her coat dusty from 2 days of riding and her dark hair escaping its braid, his expression did something complicated that she could not quite read. He handed the post driver to the older man and walked toward her. His strides were unhurried, but covered the ground quickly, the way a man walks when he has spent his whole life crossing large distances on foot. "Miss Dalton," he said. "Mr. Hawkins," she said. They looked at each other for a moment. There was a lot of history compressed into that moment, or not quite history because they had only spoken twice before this, but there was weight in it regardless. "You rode from Wichita," he said. "It was not a question." "I did. That is a hard ride in July." "I have ridden harder," she said. "Mr. Hawkins, I came because I need to return something to you." She reached inside her coat and pulled out the envelope and held it out toward him. "This." He did not take it. He looked at it and then he looked at her face, and his expression settled into something steady and unreadable. "That is yours," he said. "It is not," she said. "You left it on the table in the morning and you were gone before I woke up, and I did not have the chance to give it back to you then, so I am giving it back now. I left it because I wanted you to have it. I did not ask for your charity." "I know you did not," he said, and his voice was calm, but there was something in it, not condescension, but something more careful than that, something that took her off guard. "That is not why I left it." "Then why did you?" she said, and the question came out with more heat than she had intended, all the frustration of the 2-day ride and the weeks before it suddenly pressing up against the back of her voice. He was quiet for a moment. The older man with the fence post had gone discreetly back to his work at the far end of the paddock, and the two of them were essentially alone now in the afternoon sun, with the cattle moving slow in their pen and the windmill creaking overhead. "Would you like some water?" Noah said. "You have been riding since morning, I would guess." "I would like you to take this envelope back," she said. "Come inside," he said. "Have some water and something to eat, and then we can argue about the money." The corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile but not quite. "I have been told I am better at arguing when I am not leaning on a fence post." Rose looked at him for a long moment. The sensible thing would have been to put the envelope down on the nearest flat surface and ride back to Caldwell and catch the southbound stage to Wichita. But she was tired and thirsty, and she could smell something cooking from the direction of the house, and she had not eaten since before dawn, and Noah Hawkins was looking at her with an expression that was patient and something else, interested. She thought, genuinely interested, not in the way men at saloons were interested, but in the way a person looks when they have thought about something for a while and are unexpectedly glad of the chance to think about it more. "Fine," she said, "but I am giving the money back." "We will see," he said. That was how it began. Inside, the ranch house was cooler than outdoors, the thick limestone walls holding the heat at bay in the way of old Spanish construction, and it was cleaner and more carefully kept than Rose had expected from a bachelor household. There was a main room with a stone fireplace and a good oak table, and a kitchen built along the back wall with a proper cast iron range that was, she noticed with a cook's instinctive eye, well maintained. There were shelves of books on the wall beside the fireplace, not decorative books but read books, spines cracked and pages swollen, and a good wool rug on the plank floor, and curtains in the windows that someone had made with care, though they were old enough to be faded. He brought her water from the pump at the kitchen sink, and she drank 2 cups straight down without stopping, and he did not comment on it, just refilled the cup without being asked. "Sit down," he said, nodding at the table. She sat. He moved to the range and stirred something in a pot that smelled like beef and onions and pepper, and he cut thick slices of bread from a loaf that was on the counter and set a plate in front of her, and then sat down across from her with his own cup of water, and they ate for a few minutes without speaking. Rose had not let herself think too much about Noah Hawkins in the weeks since Wichita. She had been practical about it. the way she had always tried to be practical about things that threatened to get complicated. She had told herself a story about him that was simple and contained, a kind stranger, an unexpected gesture, an awkwardness best resolved quickly, and she had been satisfied with that story right up until she arrived at his gate and looked at the windmill turning in the wind above his house and felt her certainty begin to loosen at the edges. The truth about what had happened in Wichita was more complicated than she usually let herself think about. Rose had been in Wichita working as a seamstress at a dry goods establishment on Douglas Avenue, a job she had found 6 weeks before through a woman she had met on the stage from Dodge City. The work was steady enough, but the pay was thin, and Rose had been supplementing it by taking in alterations from the hotel on Chestnut Street, sitting up late most nights at the small table in her rented room, sewing by lamplight. She had been doing that for most of her adult life, finding ways to make a little stretch into enough, stitching together a living from whatever pieces were available. Her parents had died when she was 16, influenza taking them both in a hard winter, and she had been on her own since then, moving through a series of towns along the trails, working where work was available, saving what she could, never quite saving enough. She had first spoken to Noah Hawkins on a Wednesday morning when he came into the dry goods establishment looking for a particular kind of canvas for a pack saddle repair. It had been a brief, transactional conversation. He had been polite and direct, had found what he needed, and had left. She had not thought much about it. The second time they spoke was that same evening, at the hotel dining room where she had delivered a finished alteration, a lady's riding coat that she had taken in at the waist and lengthened at the hem. She had been on her way out when she almost walked directly into Noah Hawkins coming in from the opposite direction, and they had both stepped back and said the kind of apologetic nothing words that people say in those moments, and then he had looked at her and said, "The woman from the dry goods store. Good evening." "Good evening," she had said. "Are you dining?" he had asked. "No," she said. "I was just dropping something off." "I see." There had been a pause, the kind that in most circumstances she would have filled with a polite excuse and moved on from, but something about the way he was standing, not blocking her path but not quite out of it either, his hat in his hand, looking at her with that direct, steady attention, made her stay put for a moment longer. "The dining room here does a very good beef pie on Wednesdays," he said. "In my experience." She had told herself later that she had only said yes because she was tired of eating alone in her room, and because the mention of beef pie had been perfectly timed against an empty stomach. And that was partly true. But it was also true that there was something about Noah Hawkins that made her want to keep talking to him for a little while longer, and she had not felt that way in a considerable amount of time. They had eaten together in the hotel dining room and talked for 2 hours. It had been, and this was the part that Rose had found most unsettling in the weeks after, genuinely pleasant. Not the careful, guarded pleasantness of two strangers being polite to each other, but the kind of conversation that moved and surprised and doubled back on itself and ended up somewhere neither of them had expected. He told her about the Double H, which he had built with his own hands over 4 years after buying the land with wages saved from 2 seasons of trail work. She told him about her years of moving through cattle towns, her work, the shape of her days. He was a good listener, genuinely good, in the way that was rarer than people pretended, because he did not listen in order to formulate his next statement, but listened because he was actually interested in what she was saying. At the end of the evening, he had walked her to her rooming house on Chestnut Street and said good night at the gate, and that was all. And Rose had gone to bed feeling something warm and cautious in her chest that she had spent considerable effort the following day talking herself down from. She had slept late on Thursday morning. When she came down to the breakfast table at her rooming house, the landlady, Mrs. Greer, had handed her an envelope that had been left at the door. Inside was $200 in folded bills and a note in a plain, direct hand that said only, "For the work you do at all hours, and because the world ought to treat you better than it has. I hope this gives you some room to breathe." It was not signed, but she had known immediately, with a certainty that was both warm and infuriating, exactly who had left it. She had sat at the breakfast table for a long time looking at that money. $200 was 4 months of wages, or close to it. It was the kind of sum that changed things. That meant she could stop taking in alterations by lamplight and sleep a full night, or that she could put down a deposit on a room of her own in a better part of town, or that she could take the stage to any city she chose and start fresh with something cushioning the landing. She had never had anything cushion a landing in her life, and she could not keep it. She had known that immediately and without ambiguity, not because she was proud, well, perhaps a little because she was proud, but because accepting $200 from a man she had eaten one dinner with felt like accepting a promise she had not made, or agreeing to a transaction she did not understand the terms of. She did not want Noah Hawkins's charity. She did not want anyone's charity. What she wanted was to be treated like a person who could manage her own life, and the money, however well-intentioned, felt like evidence that he thought she could not. She had made inquiries and found out he was from Caldwell, and she had made her plans, and here she was. Now she sat at his kitchen table eating bread and beef stew in the July afternoon, and he was sitting across from her with his arms resting on the table and his blue eyes watchful, and she pulled out the envelope and set it on the table between them. "Take it back," she said. "I will not," he said. "Mr. Hawkins, Noah," he said. She looked at him. "Noah, what you did was kind. I do not dispute that, but I cannot accept $200 from a man I have had one dinner with." "Why not?" The directness of the question surprised her. "Because it is not appropriate," she said. "Is it appropriate for a woman who does excellent work and charges too little for it to sit up sewing by lamplight every night until her fingers are sore?" She felt the warmth rise in her face. "How do you know about that?" "Mrs. Greer mentioned the light in your window," he said, and his voice was quiet, not smug but steady. "I noticed your hands when you were helping me find the canvas, the calluses, the way you moved your fingers." He paused. "I am not saying any of this to embarrass you. I am saying it because the money was not charity. It was. I did not have a word for it then, and I am not sure I have one now. It was something I wanted to do because I could and because I thought it was right." Rose looked at the envelope on the table between them. She was a practical woman. She did not indulge in sentiment unnecessarily, but there was something in his voice, a plainness, a lack of performance, a quality of simply telling the truth without needing her to validate it, that made something shift in her chest. "I rode 2 days to give this back," she said. "I know," he said. "That tells me something." "What does it tell you?" "That you are stubborn," he said, and this time the corner of his mouth did become a genuine smile, brief but real, changing his face entirely. "And honest. And that you do not like to be in debt to anyone." "No," she said, "I do not." "Then keep it and consider us even," he said, "because the truth is I owe you something." "For what?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the envelope and then back at her. "For the best conversation I have had in 2 years," he said simply. Rose looked at him. The afternoon light was coming through the kitchen window at a low angle, and the whole room was golden with it. And it occurred to her, with the particular clarity that comes after a long ride and a decent meal, that she was sitting in the kitchen of a man she had thought about more than she had admitted, in a house that smelled of good wood and beeswax and the dried herbs hanging from the kitchen rafters, and that she was very much not in any hurry to get back on her horse. "Keep the money," he said again. "It is yours. I gave it freely and I do not want it back." She looked at the envelope for a long moment, then she looked at him. "Then I am staying," she said. He blinked. Whatever he had been expecting her to say, it was not that. "I beg your pardon. If I am keeping the money," she said, her voice very steady, her chin lifting slightly in that particular way she had when she had made up her mind about something and was daring the world to argue with her, "then I am not accepting it as charity, which means I will earn it, which means I am staying until I have." He stared at her. Something moved across his face, surprise first, and then something warmer. "Miss Dalton," he said slowly, Are you seriously proposing to work off a debt that I do not consider a debt? I am proposing, she said, to stay. The silence stretched between them, warm and full of something that neither of them had quite named yet. Outside, the windmill turned. The cattle moved in their pen. The July sun lay over the Kansas grassland like a benediction. "All right," Noah Hawkins said at last, his voice careful but his eyes doing something that was not careful at all. "All right, Miss Dalton. I expect you had better stay then." That first evening established a kind of rhythm between them that felt, against all reasonable expectation, entirely natural. Noah showed her the spare room, which was at the back of the house, and had its own small window looking out over the kitchen garden. It was plain and clean, with a narrow bed and a washstand and a hook on the back of the door, and it suited Rose perfectly. She was accustomed to plain. Over supper, she had insisted on finishing the preparation of it herself, since it was already half done on the stove when she arrived, and Noah had the apologetic manner of a man who knew he was not a gifted cook. They talked about the ranch. He told her about the Double H's history. He had bought the land in the spring of 1878 at the age of 26, with every dollar he had earned in 2 years of trail work from Texas to Abilene. And he had spent the first season living in a one-room camp, while he built the house with help from a pair of brothers named Bauer, who had homesteaded 5 miles to the north. The cattle operation had grown slowly. He was methodical and careful, not a man who gambled on numbers he could not account for, and now he ran a herd of around 350 head on open range that he leased from the county, with plans to expand the home pasture if the coming winter was generous. The older man who had been helping with the fence post, Rose learned at supper, was a hand named Walt Grissom who had been with Noah since the 2nd year and who lived in the bunkhouse, alongside a younger man named Danny Reeves, who was 20 years old and from Tennessee, and who arrived at the supper table with his hair still wet from the pump, and spent most of the meal sneaking glances at Rose with the frank curiosity of someone who had been expecting nothing interesting and had been proved wrong. Rose handled the supper table with the ease of someone accustomed to earning her place in unfamiliar rooms. She was forthright without being aggressive, warm without being ingratiatingly so, and she deflected Danny's obvious curiosity with a kind humor that had him laughing at himself before he realized she had done it. Walt, who was more reserved by nature, watched her the way experienced hands watch a new horse with quiet assessment that was ultimately not unkind. Noah watched her throughout the meal with an attention that he thought he was hiding better than he was. After supper, while Danny and Walt went back to the bunkhouse and Rose washed the dishes at the kitchen sink, Noah dried them beside her and they talked about Caldwell. She asked questions with genuine interest, about the cattle trade, about the town's relationship with the stockyard buyers, about the politics of the open range as the homesteaders continued to press north and east, claiming land that the large operators had been using as common grazing. Noah answered fully, and she responded thoughtfully. And by the time the last dish was dried, he was aware that he was standing in his own kitchen having a substantive conversation about the economics of the cattle business, with a woman he had known for the sum total of 1 evening in Wichita and half a day in Caldwell, and that it felt completely unremarkable. "You know a lot about cattle ranching for someone who works in a dry goods store," he observed. "My father ran cattle when I was small," she said. "Before the drought in '73, he lost everything that year. We moved to Dodge City after that and he worked at the hotel." She said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity, putting the last cup on the shelf. "I grew up listening to him talk about what he had lost, which meant I learned what made the difference between keeping something and losing it." "What made the difference?" Noah asked. She looked at him directly. "Paying attention," she said, "and not spending more than you can afford to lose." He thought about that for a moment. "Your father was a sensible man," he said. "He was," she said, "and a sad one. There is a difference between being sensible and being fortunate." "Yes," he said quietly, "there is." They were standing close enough at the kitchen counter that he could have reached out and touched her hand if he had wanted to. He did not. But the awareness of the distance between them, and the awareness that it was smaller than it had been, was there in the room between them like a third party. "Good night, Mr. Hawkins," she said, drying her hands on the towel. "Noah," he said again. She paused just slightly and then looked at him with an expression that was almost a smile. "Good night, Noah." "Good night, Rose," he said. She went to the spare room, and Noah stood in his kitchen for a long moment after she had gone, listening to the sound of her footsteps on the plank floor, and then he went to his own room and lay on his back in the dark and looked at the ceiling and admitted to himself that he was already in serious trouble. The next morning began with a misunderstanding that set the tone for their first week together in the best possible way. Rose was up before dawn, she always was. It was a habit built into her over years of early morning work, and she had the range lit and coffee on and a pan of cornbread in the oven by the time Noah came into the kitchen at 5:30, already dressed for work, and stopped short in the doorway. "What are you doing?" he said. "Making breakfast," she said. "I was going to. I saw what you call breakfast," she said, nodding at the evidence of his usual morning routine, which appeared to consist of cold cornbread from the previous day and coffee with no sugar. "Sit down." He sat down. The expression on his face was one she would come to know well over the following weeks, an involuntary softening, quickly covered by something more neutral, as if he was not quite sure what to do with being taken care of. She put bacon in the pan and sliced fresh bread and scrambled 3 eggs with a little salt and pepper, and set it all in front of him with the coffee, and he ate it in what she privately considered the satisfying silence of a person who had not realized how hungry they were until the food was in front of them. "You did not have to do this," he said. "I know I did not," she said, sitting down across from him with her own breakfast. "I wanted to." "Is there a rule against wanting to do things on your ranch?" He looked at her. "No," he said, "no rule against that." "Then stop apologizing for letting someone be useful." He ate another bite of egg. "Is that what you are doing, being useful?" "For now," she said, and then felt her face grow warm because that had come out with a suggestiveness she had not intended, or perhaps had slightly intended, and she focused very deliberately on her coffee for a moment. Noah said nothing, but there was a quality to his silence that she was already learning to read, a careful attentiveness, a kind of interior stillness that indicated he was thinking more than he was showing. In the days that followed, Rose found her place on the Double H with a speed and a natural ease that surprised even herself. She was not idle by nature, and she had no patience for sitting still when there was work to be done. And on a working cattle ranch in the summer there was always work to be done. She took over the cooking and the household without making an announcement about it, simply absorbing those tasks into her days the way water absorbs into dry earth, quietly, completely, and as if it had always been going to happen. But she did not confine herself to the house. She helped Walt men tack one afternoon in the barn, her stitching on the broken bridle so precise and strong that the old man looked at it for a long moment, and then looked at her with new respect. She helped Danny repair the kitchen garden fence when a section of it had been knocked down by a wandering heifer, and in the process she showed him a method of weaving wire that her father had taught her, which was faster than the one he had been using. She rode out with Noah on the 3rd day when he went to check the South Range, partly because she wanted to see the country and partly because she wanted to be moving and out in the air and not cooped up in the kitchen. And she rode well and without complaint and did not make unnecessary conversation on the trail, which was something he visibly appreciated. On that ride, they talked for a long time about nothing in particular and everything. About the land, about the way the grass had been beaten down in certain places by heavy grazing and what it meant for the following year's growth, about the political situation in Washington and what the new land title legislation might mean for small ranchers, about books, about music, about the particular quality of light on the Kansas plain in the early morning before the heat of the day settled in. Rose had a sharp, unconventional mind that had been educated not by schools. She had had very little formal schooling, but by years of reading whatever she could get her hands on and thinking carefully about what she read, and she was capable of moving between topics with a fluency that Noah found, she suspected, both surprising and genuinely delightful. She found herself watching him when she thought he was not looking. The way he sat his horse, easy and balanced, with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent years in the saddle. The way he treated his animals, firm but patient, without the casual cruelty that she had seen in too many men who handled livestock. The way he was with Walt and Danny, respectful, not condescending, the relationship between employer and hand operating on a basis of mutual respect that was not universally the case in the cattle business. He was not an easy man to know exactly. There was something guarded in him, a careful distance between himself and sentiment, the kind of reserve that usually meant old injury. But within that reserve there was, she was increasingly sure of this, something very genuinely warm. By the end of the first week, Rose had not mentioned the envelope again, and neither had he. On Saturday of that first week, Noah drove her into Caldwell in the ranch wagon to get supplies from the general store, and the town received her presence at his side, with the frank curiosity that small western towns always brought to anything that varied from the routine. She felt the looks from the storefronts and the boardwalk, the quick assessments and the quiet conclusions being drawn, and she held herself straight and walked beside him with a calm that cost her more than it looked like it did. The storekeeper, a heavy-set man named Albright who had the professionally jovial manner of a person whose business depended on goodwill, greeted Noah and looked at Rose with undisguised curiosity. "This is Miss Rose Dalton," Noah said, without preamble or qualification. "She is staying at the Double H." Albright shook her hand with the air of a man deciding something. Whatever he decided, it landed on courteous, and Rose was grateful for it. In the store, while Noah was talking to Albright about a lumber order, Rose moved along the shelves and found the things she needed for the household: salt and baking powder and dried beans, and a spool of good white thread and 2 candles. And then she stopped in front of a bolt of pale blue cotton calico that was leaning against the far wall. It was a beautiful fabric, well woven with a small printed flower in a slightly darker blue, and she ran her fingers along the edge of it with the automatic habit of a seamstress, feeling the weave. "Do you like that?" Noah appeared at her shoulder. "It is nice fabric," she said. "Would you like some?" She took her hand off the bolt. "No, thank you." "Rose, no," she said, and turned to look at him directly. "I told you, I'm not here to take things." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked at the fabric, and then he said very quietly, "I know you are not, but there is a difference between taking and accepting." She did not have an answer to that. She wanted one, but it would not come, and the expression on his face, patient, careful, almost painfully honest, made the argument she was forming dissolve before she could make use of it. "You are very difficult to argue with," she said at last. "So I have been told," he said. She bought the thread and the candles and left the calico where it was, and he did not press it. But when they loaded the wagon to leave, she noticed that he had added the bolt to the back along with the other supplies, and he did not look at her when he did it, and she chose not to say anything, and that was a kind of agreement between them, the first of several. In the evenings after supper had been cleared, they had fallen into the habit of sitting on the front porch in the cooler air, Noah with a cup of coffee and occasionally his pipe, Rose with her sewing. She had started a shirt for him without asking. She had noticed a tear in one of his working shirts that had been badly mended, and had quietly appropriated it from the wash pile and was remaking it properly. And she worked by the light from the lamp in the window while he read or smoked or talked, and the silence between them was the kind that needed no filling. One of those evenings, about 10 days after she had arrived, he said, without looking up from his book, "You never told me why you were in Wichita. I mean the original reason. What brought you there in the first place?" She set her sewing down for a moment. "My last position in Dodge City ended when the establishment closed," she said. "The owner retired. I needed somewhere else to go, and Wichita seemed like as good a direction as any. You did not have family to go to? No, she said, not since I was 16. He was quiet for a moment. I did not know that, he said, and his voice was careful in a way that told her he was bothered by it. You would not, she said. I did not tell you in Wichita. Is there anyone? He asked. Anyone at all? She considered the question honestly. There is a woman in Dodge City who was kind to me when I first arrived there, she said. Margaret Henley. She runs the hotel laundry. We write occasionally. But family, no. He put his book down and looked at her. The lamplight was soft, and it made the angles of his face less sharp than they were in daylight, and he looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, not quite concern, not quite tenderness, but something between the two, something that came from a part of him he was not usually in the habit of showing. My parents died in the winter of '70, he said. My mother first in November and my father in February. I was 18. Brothers or sisters, she asked. One brother, he said, Thomas. He went to California in '72. We write, but it has been 2 years since I had a letter. I am sorry, she said. He is alive, Noah said. I would know if he was not. It is just, sometimes I think letters are harder to write than they ought to be, when there is a lot between the lines that nobody knows how to say. Rose looked at him. He had said that with an ease that suggested he had thought about it a great deal and had arrived at a peace with it that was genuine rather than resigned. She thought about Thomas Hawkins in California not writing letters for 2 years and wondered what was in the space between the words that nobody had been able to say. Yes, she said simply. I know something about that. They sat in silence for a while after that, the way people do when they have said something true, and the truth does not require elaboration. It was around this time that Rose became aware of the way Caldwell received her presence at the Double H, not just with curiosity, but with a certain amount of active opinion. On her second visit to town with Noah, she encountered it directly. She was in the dry goods store while Noah was at the livery having a horse shod, and she was at the counter when 2 women came in behind her, respectable women, wives of merchants by the look of them, and they spoke to each other in the half-muffled way that is designed to be overheard. She heard the words working out there on her own with him, and no family to speak of, and people will talk, and she kept her back very straight and her face very still and finished her purchase and left the store without acknowledging that she had heard anything. But it stayed with her. She was not naive about the world, and she knew exactly what the talk meant. Not out of malice in most cases, but out of the particular small-town algebra of respectability that governed what women could and could not do without consequence. She was 24 and unmarried and living on a man's ranch, and it did not matter that her intentions were entirely straightforward and that nothing improper had occurred. The appearance of the thing was its own reality, and she had always known that, and she had chosen to stay anyway, and she was not going to pretend that did not mean anything. That evening she mentioned it to Noah, because she was not a woman who left things unsaid when they needed saying. He listened without interrupting. His expression went through something she could not quite follow, a tightening, then a release, then that stillness. I am sorry you heard that, he said. I'm not concerned about what they say, she said. I am concerned about what it means for you. This is your town, your business relationships, your reputation. I'm not going to stay here if it causes you damage. He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. Rose, he said, I want you to stay. She held his gaze. Her heart had done something at the words that she was not prepared to examine too closely at this particular moment. That is not an answer to what I said, she told him. No, he agreed. It is a different answer entirely. He paused. What would remove the cause for talk in the conventional sense? She felt the warmth rise in her face. You know what would remove it? Yes, he said, I do. We have known each other for 2 weeks, she said. And one evening in Wichita, he said. 3 weeks then. Yes, he said, 3 weeks. He was looking at her with that expression again, the careful, warm, impossibly patient one that made her want to look away but could not quite make herself do it. I'm not going to ask you something important because of what people in Caldwell are saying. That is not the right reason." "No," she said softly, "it is not." "But the thing itself," he said carefully, "is not, I mean to say, the thing itself is something that he stopped." He was clearly not accustomed to this kind of sentence, and it was costing him some effort, and the evidence of the effort was, she found, more moving than any amount of practiced eloquence would have been. "I know," she said, which was perhaps too much to say, and perhaps not enough, but it was what she said, and it fell between them with a weight that was entirely different from any weight that had come before. He reached across the supper table and picked up her hand. Just picked it up and held it with both of his, lightly, his large, work-hardened hands around her smaller one, not pressing, not demanding, just there. She looked down at his hands and then up at his face, and what she saw there undid the last of the careful structure she had been maintaining inside her chest for 3 weeks. "I did not come here to find this," she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper. "No," he said, "neither did I plan it. I came here to give back your money." "I know," he said, and the near smile was there again, the one that changed his face. "And I told you to keep it. And I said then I was staying." "You did," he said. "And I am very glad you did." She turned her hand over in his and held it back, and that was a declaration of its own sort, and neither of them needed it translated. It was not an easy thing, exactly, what happened between them over the next weeks. They were both people who had learned to be careful with themselves, who had built up habits of self-reliance and self-containment that did not dissolve overnight just because someone else had arrived to make them question the necessity of those habits. There were moments of friction. Rose was not a simple-natured woman, and Noah was not an uncomplicated man. And the process of two people who had been essentially alone for years learning to occupy the same emotional space was not without its adjustments. There was one evening in particular, about a month after her arrival, when it came to a head. Noah had ridden into Caldwell alone that morning for a meeting with a cattle buyer from Wichita, and he had not told Rose about it, not because he was hiding anything, but simply because he had not thought to mention it. The habitual independence of a man used to answering only to himself. He came home late, after supper had been kept warm on the stove for 2 hours, and Rose had sat alone at the table and eaten her own meal and she was irritated at herself for feeling it, a familiar cold uncertainty, the particular anxiety of someone who has not been given reliable information about where the people they depend on are. When he came in and she told him this, quietly and without accusation but with complete honesty, his face went still in the way that meant he was absorbing something that had surprised him. "I did not think," he said. "No," she agreed. "That was thoughtless," he said. "I am sorry." She had been prepared for defensiveness, which was what she had usually encountered when she had said difficult things to people in her life, and the simple directness of his apology caught her off guard. "I know I am not," she started. "You are," he said. "Rose, you are." And then, as if he had decided something, he crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and put his arms around her and held her, solidly, entirely, the way nobody had held her in a very long time. And she pressed her face against his shoulder and let herself be held, and the cold thing in her chest came undone. They stood there in the kitchen for a long moment, the lamp burning low on the table and the stove cooling and the wide Kansas night pressing its darkness against the windows, and he held her and she held him back, and something between them that had been building for weeks settled into place, with the simple inevitability of water finding its level. After that, things moved differently. Not recklessly. Rose was not a reckless woman, but with more honesty, as if the careful distance they had both been maintaining had served its purpose and could now be set aside. He told her things he had not told anyone. She told him things she had not spoken aloud since she was a girl. They walked the property together in the evenings when the light was long and golden, talking about the future of the ranch, about what might grow here and what might be built. She had ideas about the kitchen garden, about a smokehouse, about a system for managing the household accounts that would make the records clearer. And he listened to every one of them with that genuine attention that was one of the things she had loved first about him. And when he disagreed, he said so plainly, and they argued, and usually arrived somewhere better than either of them had started. In August, something happened that tested both of them and ultimately brought them closer together than any number of warm evenings on the porch could have managed on its own. A man came to the Double H looking for trouble. His name was Cutter Bragg. Rose never learned his first name, only the surname and the nickname, which told you everything you needed to know. And he was one of 3 brothers who ran a rough operation on the north edge of the county, ostensibly ranching but actually living a considerable part of their income on the proceeds of rustled cattle and intimidated neighbors. Noah had had dealing with the Braggs before, always tense, never fully resolved. Bragg rode into the yard on a Tuesday morning while Noah was out at the South Range, and only Walt and Danny were in the paddock, and Rose was alone in the house. He was a heavy man with a flat, mean face and the specific kind of confidence that comes from having frightened people successfully many times before. He knocked on the front door, and when Rose opened it, he looked at her for a moment with an expression that was designed to make women uncomfortable, and then said he was looking for Hawkins. Rose told him Noah was not there and he could come back later or leave a message. Bragg said he would wait. Rose told him he could wait in the yard. He said he would rather wait inside. She said he was welcome to his preference about waiting, and she was going to shut the door now, and she shut the door and locked it. Through the window she watched him stand in the yard for a moment, then go over to where Walt and Danny were working and say something to them. She could not hear what, and then Walt crossed the yard to knock on the door and told her that Bragg was claiming that Noah had fenced off a water source that the Bragg cattle had been using. Rose opened the door and spoke to Bragg directly through the screen, and what followed was a 10-minute conversation that Rose won entirely through the application of complete composure, accurate knowledge of the county's water rights ordinances, which she had read in Noah's copy of the 1880 Kansas statutes that lived on his bookshelf, and a particularly dry remark about the fact that a man who arrived at a property demanding rights generally had fewer of them than he appeared to believe. Bragg left, not graciously, but he left. When Noah came back at midday and Walt told him what had happened, his expression went through about 6 different things in rapid succession. He came into the kitchen where Rose was cutting up salt pork for the noon meal and stood in the doorway and looked at her. "You quoted the Kansas water rights statute at Cutter Bragg," he said. "The relevant passages," she said. "The book is on the 3rd shelf if you want to verify them." He stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then he crossed the kitchen and kissed her, not tentatively, not as a question, just as a statement firm and warm and completely certain. And she turned from the cutting board and kissed him back the same way, her hands flour-dusted and the salt pork forgotten on the counter. When they broke apart, she said, somewhat breathlessly, "The pork is going to burn." "Right," he said, not moving. "Noah." "Right," he said again and stepped back, and she turned back to the counter, and neither of them said anything else for a few minutes, but the kitchen felt different from that moment forward, warmer, more inhabited, like a room that has finally been given the furniture it was always meant to have. The Bragg situation resolved itself within the week, not through violence but through the intervention of the county land office, which confirmed in writing that the water source in question was on Double H property and that Hawkins had fenced it legally. Rose had drafted the letter to the land office herself, with Noah reading over her shoulder and occasionally inserting a specific legal term that she had not known, but which she learned immediately and applied correctly in the revision. The land office wrote back within 4 days with the confirmation that settled the matter, and Cutter Bragg moved his cattle to the other side of his own property and stayed there. "You are wasted as a seamstress," Noah said, when the letter arrived. "I was never only a seamstress," she said. "I know that," he said. Walt and Danny, for their part, had decided in their own way what they thought about the situation. Walt expressed his opinion by continuing to treat Rose with the same careful respect he had given her from the first day, and by beginning to refer to her, in conversation with Noah, as Miss Rose, without the formality of Dalton, which was, in Walt Grissom's vocabulary, the equivalent of a lengthy declaration of affection. Danny simply became straightforwardly devoted to her, in the innocent manner of a 20-year-old who had not been home in 2 years, and responded to any female kindness with eager and transparent gratitude. By the end of August, Rose had been at the Double H for nearly 7 weeks. She had stopped thinking of herself as a temporary presence. She was not sure exactly when she had made that shift, but she recognized it one morning when she was in the kitchen garden harvesting the last of the summer squash, and looking out over the property, the barn with its good red paint, the paddocks, the windmill, and thinking, "This place needs a root cellar on the east side of the house where the soil is coolest," and she had thought it not as an observation about someone else's property, but with the proprietary unconscious ease of someone who already lived there. Noah asked her to marry him on a Sunday evening in September. He did not make a ceremony of it, which was both completely characteristic of him and also, Rose thought, absolutely right. They were sitting on the porch after supper, she with her sewing, he with a letter he had been composing to the Cattle Association about the upcoming fall drive, and he put the letter down and turned to look at her and said, "Rose, I would like you to stay here permanently. I would like you to be my wife." She set her sewing down very carefully in her lap. "That is not very romantic," she said. "No," he agreed, "I know." He paused, and she saw in his face the thing he was not sure how to say, and waited, and he said it. "I have thought about what the right words are for a week, and nothing I came up with seemed true enough. And the truth is, I want to be with you every day for the rest of my life. You make this place feel like a home that it never was before. I love the way you think. I love the way you argue with me. I love that you rode 2 days on a hot July road to give back money that I had already given you." He stopped. His jaw was set in the way it got when he was being more vulnerable than he was comfortable with, and she loved him for the discomfort as much as for the words. "I love you, Rose. And I am asking you, very plainly, to marry me." Rose looked at him. The September evening was cooling around them, the first real cold coming down from the north in a way that promised autumn, and the lamplight from the window fell across his face, and she thought about all the roads she had traveled and all the towns she had passed through and all the rooms she had slept in alone, and she thought about the moment she had stood at the gate of this property and seen the windmill turning. "The answer was yes before you finished the sentence," she said, "but do finish them. The rest was very good." He laughed, a real laugh, not the brief near smile, but something full and warm and startled, and reached over and took her hand, and she laced her fingers through his, and they sat together on the porch in the cooling September air, and were, in the simplest and most complete sense of the word, happy. They were married in October at the Caldwell Methodist Church, on a bright cold morning, with the leaves of the cottonwoods along the creek turned yellow. The ceremony was conducted by Reverend William Marsh, a precise and amiable man who had been in Caldwell for 6 years, and who performed the rite with the brevity and warmth of someone who had learned that, in a cattle town, the most valued sermons were the ones that got to the point. Walt Grissom stood for Noah, and a woman named Clara Albright, the storekeeper's wife, who had come around to Rose completely after an afternoon spent watching her rehem a wedding dress for a rancher's daughter, with such skill that Clara Albright had not been able to stop talking about it to everyone she knew stood for Rose. Rose wore the blue calico from the general store, made up into a dress by her own hands, fitted perfectly to her figure, with a lace collar she had made herself from a length of cream cotton thread, and she looked, Noah thought, watching her walk toward him down the aisle of the small whitewashed church, like the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in his life. He told her this afterward, outside the church, in the cold October sun, which made her laugh and put her hands up against his chest, and look at him with a brightness in her eyes that he intended to spend the rest of his life doing whatever was necessary to keep there. The wedding supper was held in the church hall, to which the Caldwell community, with the particular turn-on-a-dime sociability of Western towns, had organized itself with admirable speed. There was a fiddle player and a guitar player, and dancing, and more food than could possibly be accounted for by the people who had formally agreed to bring it, because in Caldwell in 1882 a wedding was an occasion, and if you were invited, you brought your contribution, and if you had not been formally invited, you came anyway and brought more. Walt Grissom got slightly drunk on the whiskey punch and danced 3 times with Clara Albright, who appeared to enjoy it immensely, and Danny Reeves danced with every young woman in the room in a state of transport that was entirely innocent and thoroughly delightful, and Noah and Rose danced together twice, once to a slow fiddle tune that went on for a very long time, and during which they barely moved, which was technically dancing in the most generous interpretation of the word, and once to a fast reel during which Rose proved herself to be a considerably better dancer than Noah, who was a willing but imprecise participant, and made him laugh twice in a row by leading him through the more complicated footwork with the calm authority of someone who has done something so many times that helping a less skilled partner is simply second nature. They drove home to the Double H in the wagon in the October dark, under a sky so full of stars that it seemed impractical, Rose's hand tucked in Noah's arm and the night around them cold and still and immense. There was something about the drive home, the darkness and the stars and the sound of the horses' hooves on the road and the completeness of being together, that Rose knew she would remember for the rest of her life, not as a scene in a story but as a physical memory, the kind that lives in the body rather than just the mind. The life they built together at the Double H over the years that followed was not a simple or unchallenging one, because life on the Kansas frontier in the early 1880s was not simple or unchallenging for anyone, but it was built on a foundation that was as solid as the limestone walls of the house, and when things went wrong they faced them the same way they faced everything together directly, and with the deep resources of 2 people who had learned to trust each other completely. The winter of 1882 to 1883 was difficult. The cattle market softened in November, and they lost 20 head to a hard freeze in January, and there was a week in February when the wind came down from the north at a temperature that made even the most experienced plainsmen stay close to shelter. Noah and Danny spent 3 days going out in pairs to check on the cattle, bundled to the eyes in every layer they owned, and Rose kept the stove burning and the coffee hot, and the windows showing a light that could be seen from the far side of the paddock. And when they came in stamping frozen boots on the porch, she had them sitting down with hot food before they had their coats off. In the evenings of that frozen February, she sat close to Noah by the fire and he read to her. He was a good reader aloud, taking his time with it, and she had a particular fondness for the novels in his collection, which included a battered copy of David Copperfield and a complete set of Washington Irving's tales that she read cover to cover twice. And outside the wind pushed against the house and the house held, and there was a particular safety in that. In the knowledge that the walls were thick and the fire was good, and the person beside you was not going anywhere. Spring came slowly and thoroughly, and with the generosity that the Kansas land shows when it decides to be generous. The winter wheat in the field south of the barn came up green in March, and by April was standing knee-high, and the cattle that had survived the January freeze were grazing on the new grass, with the absorbed contentment of animals that have been through something hard and come out the other side. And Rose planted the kitchen garden with twice as much as the previous year, squash and beans and corn, and tomatoes from seeds she had ordered through the Caldwell General Store, and planned the root cellar that she had been thinking about since August. Noah built it for her in May, with Walt's help, digging the pit on the east side of the house where the soil was deep and cool, and lining it with good stone. Rose stocked it in August with preserves and root vegetables and smoked pork and pickled corn and dried beans, row upon row of jars with wax seals that she had spent the better part of 2 weeks making, standing at the stove in the August heat with her hair pinned up and her face flushed, and singing to herself the way she did when she was deeply content. In June of 1883, Noah received a letter from Thomas in California. It was a long letter, apologetic, careful, clearly written and rewritten several times before it was sent, explaining the long silence as the result of a period of personal difficulty that Thomas was now, cautiously, beginning to emerge from. He had been working at a mining operation in the Sierra Nevada and had married a woman named Isabella who was originally from the Sonoran region of Mexico, and they had a small child, a boy, who was called James. He asked how Noah was. He had heard from some common acquaintance whose name Rose did not recognize that Noah had married. He expressed, in the particular stiff warmth of a man who was not naturally expressive and knew it, something that wanted to be happiness for his brother. Noah read the letter twice and then put it down and looked at the fire for a while without saying anything. Rose watched him. She had come to know all the shades of his silence, and this one was the shade that meant something old was in the room with him. "Write back tonight," she said. "I was going to write in the morning." "Tonight," she said. "Tom." She had taken to calling Thomas by the shortened name without thinking, absorbing it from Noah's references to him. "Write him tonight. Tell him everything. He has asked." Noah looked at her. "You are very decided about this." 2 years without a letter," she said. "If you wait until morning, you will think of reasons to make it shorter." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he went to the desk and got out the paper and pen, and he wrote for over an hour while she sewed by the fire, and when he was done he let her read it before he sealed the envelope. It was a good letter. It said the things that needed saying. She helped him with one sentence that had gotten tangled and kissed him on the top of the head before she went to bed, and he sealed the letter and put it on the table for the morning post. And when Thomas wrote back 3 weeks later, his reply was warmer and longer and the stiffness was mostly gone. And after that, they wrote every month. Rose found out she was expecting a child in October of 1883, a year after their wedding. She told Noah on a Saturday morning in the kitchen, very directly, the way she did everything, looking him straight in the face. His expression went through something that she did not have words for. She had never seen anything like it on his face before, a kind of stunned, enormous softness, as if the whole careful architecture of his reserve had simply stood aside. He came around the table and put his arms around her and held her for a long time without saying anything, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt him shake, very slightly, once, and then hold still, and she tightened her arms around him. "Are you all right?" she said against his shoulder. "More than all right," he said in a voice that was not entirely steady. "More than I know how to say. They named the boy Samuel." He was born in June of 1884 on a morning that came in warm and blue, with the meadowlarks going in the field behind the house. And he was, from the first moment, entirely himself, dark-eyed like his mother and broad-shouldered like his father, with a temper that showed up early and a laugh that came equally early and was, everyone agreed, worth every bit of the temper. Walt Grissom's reaction to the baby was one of the more surprising and touching developments of that summer. Walt was a man of few words and minimal display, but from the first day that Samuel came home to the Double H, something in the old hand's demeanor shifted. He began finding reasons to be near the house. He made a wooden cradle, quietly and without announcement, leaving it on the porch one morning while Rose was inside. He held Samuel with a careful, practiced ease that suggested some history with infants that he never explained, and the baby, with the unerring instinct of young children, responded to him with complete trust and enthusiasm. Life at the Double H had a full rhythm now that it had not had before. Not the same rhythm as their early months, which had been the rhythm of two people learning each other, but the deeper and more complex rhythm of a household fully inhabited, a life fully lived. There were hard seasons and good ones. dry summers and wet springs, disputes with neighbors, and the ongoing slow work of building something that would last. Noah expanded the herd in 1885 when the market rose and the grazing was good, adding another 60 head and taking on a third hand, a quiet Texan named Harris who was 35 and competent, and who fit into the Double H's established order with minimal disruption. Rose continued to sow, though now it was not from necessity but from genuine love of the work. She had built up a reputation in Caldwell that had expanded beyond the town. Women from ranches across a 40-mile radius sent her fabric and measurements for dresses and riding coats and occasionally wedding gowns, and she did the work at her own table at her own pace and charged what she felt was right. And the money went into the household accounts, and Noah never commented on the amount except to say, occasionally, that she was still charging too little. She disagreed. He accepted the disagreement. This was, she thought, one of the most useful and underrated aspects of their marriage, that they could disagree fully and honestly, and it did not create a fissure between them, because the disagreement was contained inside something much larger and much more solid than the subject of the disagreement. In the spring of 1886, Thomas Hawkins and his wife Isabella and their son James came to visit the Double H. It was the first time Noah and Thomas had been in the same place in 14 years, and Rose had understood, as the date of their arrival approached, that this was going to matter to Noah in ways he was not going to say out loud. She had made up the spare room, her old room, the first room she had ever had at the Double H, with extra care, and she had spent the day before their arrival cooking. And when the wagon from the Caldwell stage depot came up the road and Noah went out to meet it, she hung back on the porch with Samuel on her hip and watched. Thomas stepped down from the wagon and he and Noah stood for a moment looking at each other. And then Noah put his hand out and Thomas took it. And then the handshake became something else. Both of them with their other arm out. The brief, fierce embrace of men who do not easily embrace but who mean it entirely when they do, and Rose held Samuel tighter and felt something bright and full in her chest. Isabella was a small, striking woman of 28 with black hair and warm brown eyes, and a direct, graceful manner that Rose liked immediately and completely. Their son James was 4 years old and shy in the initial meeting, which lasted exactly until Samuel, who was almost 2 and in the advanced stages of being a deeply sociable person, reached out and grabbed James's hand with unceremonious friendliness, at which point James forgot to be shy, and the two boys disappeared into the kitchen together on a mission involving a tin of molasses cookies that Rose had put on the lower shelf specifically within their reach. The 2 weeks of the visit were among the best of Rose's life, and she thought privately that they were probably among the best of Noah's as well, though he expressed it with characteristic restraint. She and Isabella talked for hours at a time about ranching in California and children, and the particular experience of being women who had built their lives by their own determination in places that were not always interested in making room for them. Isabella's English was excellent, but she also taught Rose several phrases in Spanish over those 2 weeks, and Rose was a quick learner with language and retained them all, which delighted Isabella and made Noah look at her with the expression she had come to think of as the expression that meant he was falling a little bit more in love with her, which she found endlessly gratifying. The evening before Thomas and Isabella left, the 4 of them sat on the porch until very late, the 2 boys long since asleep inside, with a lamp and a bottle of whiskey that had been opened in honor of the occasion, and talked about everything and nothing. And the conversation was the kind that runs so easily and with such warmth that the hours pass without anyone noticing them. Thomas, who had loosened considerably over the 2 weeks, said at one point, looking at Rose with the directness of a man who had been weighing something up and had decided to say it, "I did not know what I expected when Noah wrote that he had married, but I did not expect someone like you. What did you expect?" Rose said, "Someone quieter, I think," he said. "Noah has always kept things simple." "I am simple," Noah said mildly. You are not simple, Rose said, at the same moment that Thomas said the same words, and they looked at each other and laughed, and Noah shook his head. And the evening went on, warm and full, with the stars enormous overhead and the cattle quiet in the pasture and the double H solid and good around all of them. Thomas and Isabella went back to California with promises to visit again and to write more often, and they kept both promises. And James and Samuel kept up a correspondence through their mothers that evolved over the years into a genuine friendship. Samuel turned 3 in June of 1887, and that fall Rose told Noah she was expecting again. This time she told him in the evening, on the porch, because she had a sense, which proved correct, that the porch was where the best things happened between them. He turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was the same as the first time, the enormous stunned softness, but this time underneath it, there was something steady and sure that had not been there in the same degree 3 years ago, the sureness of a man who has been happy for a while and has learned to believe it. Are you happy? She asked him. Not about the baby specifically, but generally in the way the question contained everything. Yes, he said, very. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The September evening settled around them, cool and fragrant. I never thought I would have this, she said. Have what? She gestured, small but encompassing, taking in the house and the land and the evening and him. This, all of it. Nor did I, he said quietly. And then you rode up to my barn to give me my money back and changed everything. She laughed. I never gave it back. No, he said, and kissed the top of her head. You did not. Which was the best decision of your life? The second best, she said. The best was staying. He tightened his arm around her. Yes, he said, it was. The second child was a girl, born in April of 1888 on a rainy, soft morning that smelled of new grass. They named her Clara, for Clara Albright, who had become one of Rose's dearest friends in Caldwell. And the baby lived up to the naming by arriving in the world with a composure and a particular quality of observant calm that made even the most seasoned visitors to the Double H stop and remark on it. She had her father's light hair and her mother's creekwater eyes, and from her earliest days had the serene, watchful manner of someone who was going to understand the world very thoroughly before she committed to any opinions about it. Samuel, who was nearly 4 when Clara was born, received her with a generosity that surprised everyone and an authority that surprised no one. He had opinions about where she should sleep, about the temperature of the water when she was bathed, about what lullabies were most appropriate, and he expressed these opinions with a confidence that was deeply familiar to anyone who had known his mother. Walt Grissom, who had held Samuel in exactly this way 4 years ago, held Clara on his 3rd day at the Double H and looked at her for a long time with an expression that he did not try to compose into anything more neutral. She has your eyes, he said to Rose. I know, Rose said. I am glad of it. So am I, Noah said from the doorway. And the way he said it, simple and fully meant, made Rose look at him across the room with a feeling so complete and warm and sure that for a moment she could not say anything, and did not need to. The Double H in the years that followed grew and deepened and became more fully itself. The root cellar was expanded in 1889 to accommodate the increased household production. The kitchen garden grew to encompass a full 1/4 acre, and began supplying the Caldwell General Store with vegetables on a regular basis, which was Rose's idea, and which contributed meaningfully to the household income in the off-seasons. The cattle operation expanded twice more under Noah's careful management. He was never reckless, but he was also not timid, and he knew how to recognize the right moment and move on it. Danny Reeves married a girl from a neighboring ranch in 1889 and moved to his own place 5 miles south, but he remained a regular presence at the Double H, and his wife, a cheerful and energetic woman named Me, became Samuel's favorite person after his parents and Walt, which was high praise from a 5-year-old of Samuel's discriminating nature. Walt himself did not change much. which was in itself a kind of constancy that Rose valued more than she could easily say. He was older, they were all older, but he was at the Double H every morning and he worked with the same steady reliability. And in the evenings he sometimes came up to the house for supper, and there was always a place for him at the table without it needing to be specified. One evening in the summer of 1890, Noah and Rose were sitting on the front porch after the children were in bed. Samuel was 6 now, Clara 2, and both of them were deeply and completely asleep in the way of children who have spent the day in full engagement with the world, and Noah said, out of a long and companionable silence, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had not come to Caldwell? If you had put the envelope under my door in Wichita and left and been done with it?" Rose considered the question. The evening was warm and still and the stars were beginning to show. "Yes," she said honestly. "I thought about it on the ride up. I told myself it would be simple. Ride up, give back the money, ride home. And what did you think it would feel like? I thought it would feel like the right thing done correctly," she said. "Clean, finished." He was quiet for a moment. "And instead I saw your windmill," she said, "and something in me changed before I even knew it had." He turned to look at her. "Just the windmill. The windmill was the beginning," she said. "And then you made me sit down and eat something and argued with me and would not take the money back." She paused. "And then you said keep it, and I thought if I keep it and ride away, what do I do next? Go back to Wichita and sit up by lamplight and sew buttonholes by myself. I had done that for years and it was fine, but now there was a different option and I had enough sense to recognize it. Even though we had known each other for 3 weeks. Even though," she agreed. He reached over and took her hand. "I am glad you had the sense," he said. "You should thank the money," she said. "If you had not left it, none of this would have happened." "Is that so?" He said with the near smile. "That is so," she said firmly. "Your inexplicable generosity started everything." "It was not inexplicable," he said. "I knew exactly why I left it. You said you did not have a word for it." "I said I did not have a word for it then," he said. "I have a word for it now." She looked at him. The lamplight from the window was warm on his face. "What word?" she said. He looked at her steady, certain, the patient blue eyes that she had been looking into for 8 years and still found surprising in their depth. "Love," he said. "It was love. I did not know it yet, but it was." Rose held his gaze for a moment. The word sat between them, plain and exact and entirely right, the way the best words do when they are finally given to the things they belong to. "That is a good word," she said. "The best one," he said. She leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and the Double H was quiet around them, and the stars were fully out now, and the windmill turned slow in the evening wind, and from inside the house came the small, unintelligible sound of Samuel talking in his sleep, which made both of them smile at the same moment. They sat there a long time, not talking, not needing to, the way that people who have chosen each other well and stuck to that choice through hard winters and good springs, and all the ordinary extraordinary days between them can sit, in the full and undemanding warmth of belonging to each other, while the night spreads its enormous Kansas sky above them, and the land lies quiet, and the life they have made together holds itself around them like a house with good walls and a fire that never goes out. The years gathered themselves around the Double H like rings in a tree, each one adding depth, each one building on the last, each one marking growth that could be measured in more than the count of the cattle or the number of jars in the root cellar, though those numbers were good too. Samuel grew into a boy of startling energy and stubborn intelligence, with his father's steadiness underneath and his mother's fire on the surface, which was, according to Noah, the right way around. He learned to ride at 4 and was competent at 5, and by 6 was accompanying Noah on the short-range checks, with an authority that made Walt watch him sidelong and nod to himself in the manner of a man recognizing something inevitable. He could not yet read well, but he was learning, and Rose sat with him every evening at the kitchen table with the primer and the patience that she had in endless supply for the things that mattered, and progress was steady if not rapid, which was fine because the important things were rarely rapid. Clara, at 2, was still mostly the observant, serene creature she had been from birth, but she had begun to assert a will that was, Rose recognized with a private amusement, entirely familiar. She had decided views about which cup was hers, which spot on the porch was hers, and which pieces of bread had the right amount of butter, and she expressed these views with a calm certainty that brooked no argument, and frequently stopped Noah mid-sentence with the raised eyebrow that she had apparently been born knowing how to produce. "She is exactly like you," Noah told Rose one evening, when Clara had informed him by simple sustained stare that the cup he had given her was not, in fact, the correct cup. "She is her own person," Rose said. "Her own person," Noah said, looking at his daughter with an expression of profound admiration. "Who is exactly like you?" The spring of 1891 brought a good cattle price, and the decision to build a second bedroom onto the north side of the house, so that Samuel and Clara could each have their own room. They were currently sharing, an arrangement that was increasingly complicated by the fact that both of them had strong opinions about the arrangement. The room went up in May, built with seasoned timber from the Caldwell mill, and it was done before the summer heat set in, and Samuel moved into it with the sober satisfaction of a person entering their rightful domain. That same spring, Rose received a letter from Margaret Henley in Dodge City, her old friend from the hotel laundry, the woman she had mentioned on that first porch evening as the closest thing to family she had outside of the Double H. Margaret was 62 and in good health, but found herself alone in Dodge City with the laundry business becoming too much for her to manage alone, and the letter had the quality, underneath its careful and matter-of-fact phrasing, of a person who was not quite asking for something but who was close to it. Rose read the letter twice and then went and found Noah in the barn and told him about it, sitting on the fence of the near paddock while he checked a horse's hooves for stones. He listened, and when she had finished he put the horse's hoof down and looked at her. "Ask her to come," he said. "I had not gotten that far yet," Rose said. "Yes, you had," he said. She looked at him and felt the warmth that was always there, always when he knew her that well. "The house is not that large," she said. "We just added a room," he said. "Walt uses the bunkhouse. The spare room is the spare room." "She is a specific person," Rose said. "Margaret, she has her routines." "So did you," he said, and looked at her with a directness that was entirely affectionate. "And you adapted, right to her. Ask her." Rose wrote that evening. Margaret arrived in June on the Caldwell stage, a small, iron-haired woman of 62 with the weathered pragmatism of someone who has done physical work her whole life and knows exactly what she is worth. And she stepped off the stage and looked at Rose and then at the wagon and then at Noah and said, in the manner of someone taking an inventory, "Well, you have done well for yourself, Rose Dalton." "Rose Hawkins," Rose said. "Rose Hawkins," Margaret repeated, as if filing this correction away. "Yes. I can see that." She shook Noah's hand with a directness that he met equally, and that was enough for both of them. Margaret became, in the way of the Double H, simply part of it. She ran the spare room with the same precise economy with which she had run the hotel laundry, everything in its place. Nothing wasted. The bed made at 6 every morning regardless of weather or occasion. She was not a woman who talked unnecessarily, which meant that, when she did speak, she was generally worth listening to. And Rose and Noah both found, to their mutual satisfaction, that she had a dry, precise wit that emerged without warning and was devastatingly accurate. She was particularly good with Samuel, who recognized in her a fellow person of strong convictions and treated her accordingly, with a respect that was, coming from a 7-year-old, among the most genuine forms of respect available. She taught him to play checkers with a ruthlessness that was educational in the best sense, and he lost the first 20 games and began winning occasionally by the end of the first month, which both of them considered adequate progress. The children grew. The cattle operation grew. The Double H settled into itself more fully with each passing year, the way good things do, not dramatically but with the steady accumulation of days well lived. Mornings and evenings and suppers and arguments and laughter, and the particular comfort of lying in the dark next to someone who knows all of you and has chosen to stay anyway. In 1893, Rose's reputation as a seamstress extended itself in an unexpected direction when Clara Albright, her great ally in Caldwell, commissioned her to make the costumes for the town's 4th of July celebration, 32 costumes of varying complexity, representing figures from American history, for a pageant that the school was producing. Rose managed the project with the organizational efficiency of a general and the aesthetic sensibility of an artist, working 3 weeks straight with her sewing table covered in pattern pieces and fabric samples, and the pageant was a success of such magnitude that the school committee wrote her a formal letter of thanks, which she framed and put on the wall beside the fireplace because Noah insisted. "You are embarrassing me," she told him. "You deserve to be embarrassed by good things occasionally," he said. "It is different from the other kind." She had no argument to that. In the fall of 1894, Samuel turned 10 and Clara turned 6, and the Double H had been home to Rose and Noah for 12 years, and on their 12th anniversary they sat on the porch in the October evening, the same porch, the same cool air. The cottonwoods along the creek turned yellow again, and Noah said, as he sometimes did on anniversaries, "Best decision I ever made." "Telling me to keep the money," she said. "Yes," he said. "You are very self-satisfied about that," she said. "I am," he agreed. "I believe I have earned it." She leaned her head on his shoulder. He put his arm around her. Samuel was inside doing his letters at the kitchen table, arguing quietly with Margaret about the correct spelling of a word, which meant they were both doing well. Clara was already asleep, having informed the household at 7:30 that she was tired with the same crisp authority with which she did everything, and the house had been quiet from her direction ever since. "Do you remember what you told me the morning after you arrived?" Noah said. "I told you many things that morning," Rose said. "I was in a mood. You told me there was a rule against wanting to do things on my ranch," he said, with the recall of someone who has saved certain sentences carefully. "I remember," she said. "What I wanted to say then," he said, "and did not quite manage, was that I wanted you to want things on my ranch. I wanted you to want things here. I had been hoping for it without knowing that was what I was hoping for, and then there you were, making breakfast as if you already belonged here, and he stopped. The old articulation difficulty, the place where language and feeling met and did not always produce clean sentences. I thought, she already belongs here. Before I had any right to think that." Rose was quiet for a moment. The October evening was around them, cool and clear. "I thought the same thing," she said, "about the 4th day. I was in the kitchen garden and I was thinking about a root cellar, and I caught myself thinking it as if the garden were mine, and it frightened me a little." "Why?" "Because I wanted it to be mine," she said, "and wanting things that you are not sure you are allowed to want is frightening." "You were always allowed," he said, "from the first day." She looked up at him. The lamp was on in the window behind them, and it caught the silver that was coming in at his temples now, and the laugh lines at the corners of his eyes that were deeper than they had been 12 years ago, and all of it was familiar and beloved and entirely hers. "I know that now," she said. "I know you do," he said. They stayed on the porch until the October cold drove them inside, and inside was warm and bright and full of the sounds of the household. Samuel's voice, Margaret's measured reply, the fire in the hearth, the house around them solid and good, and Noah took her coat when they came in the door and hung it on the hook beside his own, the two coats side by side in the ordinary way of two lives long since woven into one. And Rose Dalton, Rose Hawkins, though she thought of herself as both, carrying both names the way she carried all the versions of herself that had brought her to this place, looked at the room and the fire and the husband who had once left her money she had not asked for and then refused to take it back, and she thought, "I came here to give back $200 and I got a life." And she felt the deep, unhurried satisfaction of a woman who has arrived, at last, exactly where she belongs, in a house that was always going to be hers if she had the courage to stay. And she had stayed. That had been the only thing required in the end, and the best thing she had ever done. She had stayed, and the windmill had turned above her every morning since, and it would go on turning, she thought, for as long as there was wind and the will to be here, which was to say, she thought, putting her hand in Noah's as they crossed the kitchen together to say good night to their children forever, which was exactly what she intended.